start, if that's all right. My name's Helen Salmon. I'm a comrade from Birmingham. I'm going to be chairing this meeting on how do we organise to end oppression. Speaker who is Jan Nielsen, who's a long-standing socialist activist who's campaigned for women's liberation for a long time. And she's a teacher in South London. She'll introduce the talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open up for any questions and debate, which will take just by sort of show of hands in that session, okay?
Okay, well there's just 3 little points actually I want to make before I really start the meeting. First is that, as I tell my students, as I'm a teacher, as I tell my A-level students, always read the exam question very carefully. And I have to admit I failed to do it when I looked at I misread the title of the meeting to some extent. So I make an apology straight at the beginning that I'll mainly be talking about women's oppression because I thought it was about the ending of women's oppression. And so if you would like to, and you feel you want to make a contribution about race or about transgender or LGBT, then please write your contributions now because you will certainly have something to say. I'm going to focus on women. The second thing I just want to say is that I don't think I can do a meeting on fighting women's oppression without making, really making a tribute to a woman who isn't here with us today, and many of you in the audience will know her, Julie Waterson, because it took me, in the 24 hours I've been writing this meeting, she was a long-standing comrade, an absolutely inspirational figure for me, and a long-time friend. And it would have been her that I would have discussed the meeting with, it would have been her that I would have fine-tuned it with. And so if there's any flaws in it, it's really because Julie, my friend, is no longer with us. But to be honest, I thought of Julie in the opening rally of Marxism. And any of you who had the privilege to be there will have heard Marion speak. Now, I have to raise my hat to Scottish working class women. And she is my pin-up of Marxism because she personified for me everything that I have tried, and that I believe the SWP has tried to do, in fighting for class liberation. A working class woman from the schemes at the forefront of the struggle is the picture that I have in my mind when I do a meeting like this. But so on with the meeting. Now, it's maybe your misfortune if you've been following this series that by necessity, I think I'm the last one in the series, you are going to hear a summary of some of the things that have already been said. So I apologise for that. But I start really with the question, or really the stereotype very often that is put forward of Marxists, but really we are only interested in class struggle, we're only interested in the relations of capitalist production, and we're only interested in alienation, and that for some reason oppression is just something that we tag on to the side of our politics. It's something that will right itself after the revolution, and I think we have to debunk that myth straight away because it is very far from the truth, because you cannot look at any struggle in the 19th or the 20th century in which Marxists haven't played a leading role, whether it's about the question of sexism and women's oppression or whether it's about racism. Marx and Engels wrote about the American Civil War and engaged in an important debate with the British workers' movement about the importance of supporting the North against the South. Marx himself said that labour with a white skin will never be free while those in a black skin are in chains. It was mentioned in the last meeting that Engels and Marx both saw anti-Irish racism, the question of imperialism, as absolutely central to the workers' struggle of the 19th century. If you look at the correspondence between Marx and Engels right through the 1880s, the question of the woman's question was always something that they were discussing and debating. And I don't think it's any accident that it was Eleanor Marx who really wrote one of the first books on the women's question. If you look at the question of anti-Semitism, all of the most incisive accounts of the question of Jewish oppression have been written by Marxists like Abraham Leon. And you can take that right through to America in the 20s and 30s. It was Communist Party members in America, in the USA, in South Africa, who fought over the question and led the struggles against oppression. And today, obviously, we are proud as SWP members to be the key figures from the anti-Nazi League through to the UAF. The question of racial oppression and Islamophobia has been central and has often distinguished us from many of the other left organisations. So it's an integral part of our tradition. It's not something we bolt on. And it's integral because we understand that the self-emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, but women are half of that class, and their involvement is crucial if we want to win that battle. We also understand that divisions along the lines of people's gender or people's race is something that the entrenched divisions are going to be something that make that fight more difficult, weaken our inability to build the class unity that we really need. But I want to also say that in order to fight oppression, we have to understand where it comes from. Indeed, Marx did so, or I think it's Lenin actually said, if you can understand society by looking at the surface, nobody would need science. So I make no apology, although there's been meetings on it earlier, to say that we have to start with the writings and the theory of Engels. Now I'm not going to go into, because there was a meeting on, I think, the first evening, a detailed meeting, about Engels' understanding of the rise of private property and the state. And he talked about the world's historic defeat of women, because Engels was looking and studying hunting and gathering societies, using the anthropological studies by others that had been done on hunter-gatherer societies, societies that accounted for 90% of human existence on the planet. And what Engels saw, and many others, you know, the anthropologists have repeated these findings, people like Eleanor Burke-Leacock, people like Evelyn Reed in Women's Evolution, all the studies of those societies show that actually inequality wasn't a natural form of human social relationships, that indeed those societies had an unprecedented level of equality between the sexes and between the genders. But once you saw the ability, once societies moved from hunter-gathering societies to societies, agricultural societies, where there was a possibility of providing over and above what people could carry, i.e. a surplus, you begin to see the accumulations, the first beginnings of the accumulations of wealth. You begin to see the rise of a class, a small class that controls that wealth. And what was very central to the accumulation of wealth was that you had to impose on women some form of monogamy in order to be able to guarantee descent through the property owning families. And as I say, Engels called that the beginnings of the world historic defeat for women. But it wasn't just about women. All sorts of collective child-rearing practices were abandoned, loose pairing relationships where people had a lot more freedom about who they slept with and who were their partners. that you began to see the imposition, the first beginnings of the imposition of a family structure that would establish divisions, hierarchical divisions between men and women, and would mean that women became the property of men as they were, as the property was handed down through to their children. So it was important. What was really important about Engels is that he locates for Marxists a material explanation of women's oppression located in the family. And it's difficult for us, I think, now, looking back, in hindsight, to really understand what a revolutionary idea that was. Because he was taking on the notion of the idea that women's subjugation was a natural part of human relationships, and imagining that being published in 1884 at a time in which the ruling class, the factory-owning ruling class and the government were imposing a new style of privatised family on the 19th century family. So it's important for us because it gives us a material explanation of where really women's oppression comes from. And what's important, I think, also is that if we start with Engels, we're able also to understand how the family has changed, and it's changed enormously from the 19th century to today. It's important to understand that it changes its nature according to the needs of capitalist accumulation. So that if you look at the family in the 19th century, when Engels was writing his books, and he and Marx were discussing and were alive, actually, when they looked at the family in the new industrial revolution, they actually thought that the family might disappear. They believed the family was disappearing because it was a very different family from that had existed in feudal society, where in feudal society it was really privatised production and reproduction, in terms of most goods were produced in family homes, in hamlets. But in the 19th century, everyone, women, children, irrespective of gender or age, everyone was pulled into factory organisation. Everyone was a producer. The family home was torn apart. And there, because it suited the needs of capitalism. But once you got a situation where infant mortality rates were something like 60% in most communities, the ruling class needed to reimpose a new type of private family in which reproduction and the recuperation of labour could be kept done without any cost to the ruling class. You see a plethora of legislation, you see an assault on and an assault that pushed women in particular, or tried to push women back into the home. You get the idealised notion of a bourgeois family where women do the private reproduction of the next generation of labour. They are the people responsible for nurturing and the care of the next generation, and the man goes out to work. Now, it was always an ideal, because for most women, despite much of the legislation which took women away from some of the areas of work that were most dangerous to reproduction, actually women really continued to work. But the family was styled according to the needs of capitalist accumulation. Now, I want to say also just, a bit, because it is the case, I think, that when we talk about oppression today, it is very, very different from that of my grandmother or even my mother. But actually, it's still, the family plays an enormously important role. Now, I think it's changing to a large extent under neoliberal policies, and particularly as we see much of the socialised support for the family, like the NHS, like nurseries, like good quality childcare, which to a large extent, did exist from 1945 up till really the 1980s. We see more and more of the burden, really, of the care of the elderly and children being pushed back into the family home. I mean, it's interesting, not just, you can look at a whole number of things at the moment that are happening. I mean, I notice, and I have a vested interest in this, that actually they estimate now that most young men aren't going to be leaving the family home till at least they're 27. Now that is much older than it was for me. I left school at 16. I was an apprentice hairdresser, and by the age of 19, I was sharing a flat in London with other women that I worked for. That is not going to be possible for my children or most young people today. That, more and more of the burden of care. University fees mean that young people can't actually afford to start up homes on their own. They call them now boomerang children. I don't know any woman or man of my age who isn't thinking about what they're going to do with their children when they leave university. It wasn't a question for my mother. She didn't have to think about it because the opportunities for me and women of my generation were much better. If you look at, I think it's interesting, at the NUT conference recently, we discussed the issue of violence against women. I mean, it's estimated that 1 in 4 women actually experience violence in the home, and I believe that this figure is going up as austerity cuts mean that many families are forced to stay together. It isn't often possible. You talk to women at work in unhappy marriages, we used to call them empty shell marriages in sociology. Those are now on the increase, because if you want to leave a husband or want to leave a partner because you're not very happy or there is any kind of stress, now it's much more difficult for women to do that, or much more difficult for men. People are forced into stay in unhappy relationships because the economic circumstances have changed. Certainly, I think it's also important for us to stress that, when I was young, or my mother's generation, the idea of making yourself attractive to a man was actually putting on some lipstick and what they used to call an uplift bra. Yeah, that was basically how you got yourself. Now, we only have to pick up any women's magazine. To be honest, you only have to go to the dentist to see the adverts for cosmetic surgery, for blimmin' implants, the fact that we've seen a massive rise in labia reconstructions amongst young women. Look at the polls. Most young women feel highly dissatisfied about themselves and don't believe that they'll ever be attractive to a man. They won't get a man unless they've had a Brazilian, unless they've had some kind of cosmetic surgery, and no woman of my age worth her salt can possibly appear even on the television anymore if you're over 45, but you can't possibly be attractive unless you've had some kind of cosmetic stretching of your face from back to, from front to the back of your head. So actually, we have to say that certainly, although my life opportunities are completely different, my life is unrecognisable from my grandmother or my mother, that actually we have to say all the most backward ideas about women, the most awful ideas about women are still very, very much with us, if not. I also, obviously, I should have said, really, the question about pornography, because I am increasingly concerned as a teacher, the NUT has produced a brilliant big survey about what is happening in our schools in terms of sexism, the experience of young girls. I know I work in a porter cabin, in a, very bog standard, comprehensive in Balham. There is very often, I'm telling you, a chair behind my porter cabin. And I just want you to imagine, I've had to rescue girls from there, giving blowjobs to boys behind the porter cabin. This is a real experience which has been exacerbated beyond anything that my mother would have thought of. I mean, my mother thought pornography was finding, as she would have said, dirty magazines under your dad's bed. I mean, that was the extent in those days. Now, our children's lives are absolutely permeated, both girls and boys, because don't think it doesn't affect boys in a very big way. It totally distorts their attitude towards women, their attitude about their own sexuality, their need to have, six-packs, etc. It totally distorts the world in which our children's sexual lives and the problem are going to shape up. And the problem is, it's sold, the commodification of women's bodies is sold to us as some kind of empowerment or liberation. I was really struck just a couple of weeks ago, it kind of passes me by because I'm 58, but actually I had an argument with 3 very good teachers in my classroom who were off to watch Beyonce, yeah? Because they believed Beyonce was doing some kind of liberation, feminist concert somewhere in Wembley. The idea that in some way, if you've ever watched any of Beyonce's videos, the idea that in some way Beyonce is some kind of empowered woman because she's sexy and because she's attractive, this is now sold to young people in a massive extent. So I want to say, certainly from virtually the birth to the grave, the idea that women are judged solely on what they look like is now something that permeates every stage of a woman's life. My mum, before she died, said to me, actually, Jan, I think it was better in our days because, once you got past 40, you didn't have to do it anymore and you didn't have to bother. And you only have to look, around to think maybe she was right. Now, the question for us, obviously, the question for most of this meeting is how do we fight the question of oppression? And I want to say something again that really has kind of been raised in a lot of the other meetings, and I want to stress it very, very strongly. Because if you look at the fights for women's liberation, there is, or fights against women's oppression, there is a direct correlation between the confidence of progressive movements and class struggle and the rise of the question of fighting women's oppression. It was the case in, certainly from the French, it's been the case from the French Enlightenment onwards. It was no accident that Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women from the background of the Enlightenment ideas of Voltaire and others at that time. If you look at some of the gains that were made for women in the 1850s, it really comes out of the fact that so many women were involved in the Chartist movements. They built their own Chartist organisations. Dorothy Thompson has written extensively about the involvement of women. No accident, therefore, that many of the Chartist demands reflected those interests of women. If we look at second wave feminism, it didn't come from nowhere. It came, particularly in America, out of the radicalisation of the black movement and the anti-war movement, and in Britain it came out of a series of strikes, starting with the equal pay strikes, like at Ford's Dagenham, the Leeds clothing women almost exclusively, I mean I think it was totally exclusively women, the telephonists of the GPO, and the night cleaners strike, the big campaign around London and other major cities, led by a woman called May Hobbs in Fulham, and that was a strike that spread. And it was no accident, therefore, that in Britain, the demands of the women's liberation movement of the 1970s were 4 basic, concrete material demands that were going to benefit, essentially, working class women. The question of abortion and free access to abortion and contraception, the demand for equality of education and equality at work, the demand for 24-hour nurseries, and for equal pay. These were shaped by the fact that at that point, the British working class was combative, it was buoyant, and it was on the move. And those things were directly related to each other. Again, it's no accident that that movement declined at the time that we called the downturn. And you only have to read a chapter of a book, Beyond the Fragments, Lynn Siegel's chapter, to see what happened to the women's movement. It became obsessed about identity. It tore itself up by arguing about the question which we referred to at the last meeting of the hierarchy of oppression. But when we talk about how we fight, one of the important things is we learn really from the high points of history. So the women's movement in Britain. But our real high point has to be the Russian Revolution. Now, everybody will know, and again, I think you have to imagine Russia as it was in 1917, not look at it through the prism of our experience today. Russia was one of the most backward countries, but yet Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood that actually a revolution, to be successful, to establish a communist society, you had to have the full involvement of the most oppressed in that society. So sexual equality was central to the agenda of the Bolsheviks. They legislated for the votes for women. They legislated for equal pay. They brought about divorce for women for the first time. The question of maternity leave. They abolished the distinction between legitimate children and illegitimate children. They abolished the notion of adultery. And even Trotsky, to his credit, when he married his wife, took her name, and the children that they bore held her surname right through their lives. Now, this has to be understood because actually Lenin at the time, 2 years after the revolution, said, you look at what we have done for the question of women, nothing like it has been repeated in the 130 accumulated years of social democracy in republican states across the world at that time. I would argue, if you took the hundreds now of years of accumulated social reformism, even if you look to countries like Scandinavia and Finland, there has never been as much done in the name of liberating women, right throughout history, as there was done in that very, very short time. But also, Alexandra Kollontai, the leading Bolshevik woman, really understood and learned from the writings of people like Engels, because she focused almost exclusively her work on getting rid, and I meant to bring the quote and I forgot it, but she talks about how women will never be free if we don't abolish the kitchen, that women had to be taken from the kitchen and helped in every way possible to be fully fledged members of society. So again, the communal kitchens, the communal laundries, and anyone, I'm sure there's some of us here, anyone who has been a mother, not a wife, because it's interesting. If you look at the statistics about equality, when you first set up with a partner, there's a very equal distribution of responsibility in the home. Men tend to do half of the housework when you first set up with them when you're single. But once children come along, your lives change. Yeah? We are tied to the drudgery of privatised child rearing and childbearing. So the question of communal facilities was absolutely vital to the understanding that the Bolsheviks had, that they had to provide services which would take the privatised labour inside the home. They would liberate, and it would become a social responsibility, not an individual one. But also, what I want to say is that, again, what is very, very different now from my grandmother's life or my mother's life, and it is really that now the vast majority, overwhelming majority of women are in the workforce. Yeah, it isn't. It's very rare now. I mean, we do have a bit of it, I have to say, in South London. There's an area just around, quite near my school, that's called Buggy Valley. And it's the place where Mumsnet was really set up. It's a place where you see a lot of blonde women driving tanks, we call them, but you know, they're Range Rovers, four-wheel drives, etc. The cafes during the day are full of women with small babies, and they tend to be, by and large, very affluent women who are married to men who can keep them in the home. That is not the experience for the overwhelming majority of women. The overwhelming majority of women are active in the workplace, and we heard the figure this morning that 55% of trade unionists are women. Now that is, again, very, very different. When I first joined the SWP in 1976, to be honest, if you had a photograph of a strike, or certainly if you had a photograph of a strike in Socialist Worker, it was very often, almost exclusively, a picket line of men in the industrial sector at Longbridge or in the factory of the car plants. It was about the building workers on the big strikes, you know, on the Barbican, etc. Now you only have to look at the pictures in any newspaper, pictures of struggle, pictures of protest, pictures of strikes, and you always see very large numbers of women, and sometimes exclusively of women. Marx talked about this when he talked about how capitalism had a contradiction that was deeply embedded in it, and that is that capitalism may brutalise us, alienate us, but actually it also builds its own gravedigger, the organised working class. And I think we have to be very, very clear for the fight against oppression that the focus on the organised working class is very important, not just because women are so numerically represented in it now in a way that they weren't in the 70s, but it's actually the organised working class that has the power to change society, to make a real difference, and to get rid of the rotten system that we live in. So we have seen over the last number of years, if you look at the big pension strike 2 years ago, very, very highly represent the public sector workers, very highly represented in it. Certainly on my local PCS picket line, which I now visit, you know, it's great because you know you can visit it more and more often as these strikes progress. Mostly actually low-paid black women, and we see in the bedroom tax, particularly, how all of the benefit cuts mean that large numbers of women are disproportionately affected by these in proportion to men. And I say about the importance of the organised working class and particularly the work that we may do and should be doing in trade unions, not from a syndicalist perspective, but I want to really end by talking about what we mean in the SWP when we talk about political trade unionism. And I want to give an example really, not just because I am a teacher, but it was my experience just last Easter about what being a political trade unionist means in a union where the vast majority of the workers are women, and a very high number of those, a very high percentage of teachers now are below the age of 30. I am by far the oldest trade unionist in my branch. By decades, the average age is about 28 or 30. And really, in the MUT, I think at last year's conference, we gave a model of what political trade unionism means. Of course, as trade unionists, we have a duty to fight over the bread and butter issues. Things like pay, things like pension cuts, things like, the appraisal system, or any of the other shit that the managers are going to throw at us. But actually, at our conference, we organised a fringe meeting over the question of immigration. We realised it isn't just enough to be a good militant in your workplace. We have to bring the politics of oppression into our workplace, into the places where we are strong. So we organised around the question of immigration and Islamophobia. All of us wore bedroom tax t-shirts and raised the question of the bedroom tax and the attacks on benefits from the floor and from the platform. It was our comrades in Lambeth who brought forward a motion on raunch culture as a result really of the sexist reports about sexism that had come up by the MUT, and pledged the union to take this up and to fight it. It was us that raised a recent report. If 1 in 4 women are experiencing domestic violence in their home, then thousands of the children that we teach must be watching this and experiencing this every day. So if you look at what we've done over the war, raising, the stop the war movement in our unions, we as revolutionaries have a duty to bring those things into the working class movement. And certainly the question, because, and many people have spoken about it already today, that really the Revolutionary Party has to be the tribune of the oppressed. And that does mean that all of us, without exception, have to take up the question of the fight against racism and the question of sexism. I believe that we have a record second to none about involving ourselves and supporting those struggles against oppression wherever they have manifested themselves. But I say this about movements, which I think is important. Movements are not ideological vacuums. Inside any movement against oppression, there are ideologies. There is often reformism. Owen Jones is brilliant at talking about oppression and, alienation and, the importance of the working class, but still remains a member of the Labour Party. I believe Laurie Penny, who talks very wittily about her own experience. She's become a bit of a kind of guru amongst some of the women's groups, etc., that have been set up in the universities. But actually, she has no analysis of where women's oppression has come from. She just talks about the everyday experience, the superficial, what the obvious in a way. And so for us, what's important is that we have to work with all those groups that are fighting over the question about oppression, but we have to try and shape that ideology. Because just as the fight against oppression rises and falls with the fate of the class struggle. The fall often pushes us backwards. The fact that the second wave feminism, it educated, it argued, it talked, but actually, in the end, it went down the road of reformism. Most of the leading feminists of the second wave feminism went into the Labour Party, went into the GLC. They believed they were going to change society from within, because we didn't win in second wave feminism. The arguments for the need for a revolutionary change in society. As we speak, or certainly, a couple of days ago, 17 million people took to the streets of Egypt. I would argue very, very strongly that protest itself, standing up and complaining, marching is not enough. We know that for real liberation to come to the people of Egypt, just as we want real liberation here, will take the overthrow of a class society in which oppression is embedded. But in order to have that revolutionary change, we are going to have to argue with people and we have to learn to both work with people when they are right, when they're in activity, when they are marching, but also learn that we have to have an independent argument, a polemic with those people, not a discourse, a polemic over the question of how we change society, where real power lies, so that we don't end up like the aftermath of the second wave of women's liberation, for many of our daughters in a worse position than it was for us.
Thanks, Jan. As I said, we'll now have debate any questions from the floor. I'll ask people to stick to 3 minutes and I'll tap the mic after 2. Do you want to go first and I'll write down the other names as he's speaking? Do you want to use this one? Do you want to stand up?
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of bits about the LGBT liberation. So I'm supposed to work when I'm active on the union's LGBT National Committee, and there's been quite an argument within the LGBT trade unions and the LGBT side over Islamophobia. In fact, a motion unfortunately got passed saying Islam is the main religious problem in terms of LGBT liberation at the TUC's LGBT conference this year. And it's one of those things that we have to have a big argument against it. My argument against it is because that I've been arguing against sexism and racism in the workplace. The management actually tried to get a grievance against me and tried to get me suspended a few years ago. But because people know that, the only actual problems I have in my current workplace as a more male have actually been one or two straight white men who've got issues with their own sexuality or sex life or whatever. It hasn't actually been the Filipino Catholics or the African Christians or the male Muslims who have had an issue with my sexuality because they know that I'm standing against oppression. The reason that I'm in the SWP is something happened to me many years ago when I worked in the cinema up in Gateshead in the time at Weir. I was outed at work and I faced a load of abuse at work from the people I worked with. I was told, hope you die of AIDS, you fag bastard, every single day. There's no law against bullying and against discrimination in those days. Even today there's no law against bullying and harassment unless it's attached to an equality strand or you complain and then go for constructive dismissal. But there's no protection in those days. I had to put up with it. And then the manager sacked me 3 months after I was outed. And every single person in that workplace, with no union, stood with me against the management and said, what you've done is wrong, and I was the first person to win my job back in the 7 years It was only 4 years later when I came to Marxism in 1995, I realised that I'd never thought, why is there homophobia? I mean, it has to do, homophobia specifically more to do with the role of the family under capitalism. And that's why that's why there is homophobia. I never thought, why is there and how do you challenge it? And after I won my job back, the homophobia died down. And the reason that you can't win equality through reformism is because when we strive, we change ourselves. When you're on the picket line, when you're fighting alongside people, you change your own ideas. I change my ideas about bigots because I see some of them can change their ideas when you work with them, and actually that breaks down the homophobia, the racism, the sexism, the transphobia, whatever the issue is. When you see yourself as part of the class, and I'd never had that analysis until I came to Marxism in '95, and I have seen people change, and that is why the mass movements, they are so inspiring, and that's why we have to be part of them as LGBT or black or whatever, but we have to fight for liberation within them, and it's only through fighting for liberation within them we can ever actually achieve it.
To pick up on a point that you mentioned about the direct correlation between class struggle and struggles against oppression, because I think that's a really important point, but I think we need to think a little bit more carefully about what the relationship is between the two, rather than simply saying that when class struggle goes up, struggles against oppression go up as well, because I think we need to go back to thinking about the relationship between the political and the economic, like Rosa Luxemburg wrote about brilliantly, lots of other people have written about. I think we have to think about what it is that inspires confidence in people to actually fight, and what kind of period we're in where those struggles are likely, where the sort of tipping points and the sparks of struggle and resistance are likely to come at any particular point in time. I think if you think, like talking about the women's movement, like you did, I think that it is absolutely true that that the women's movement came at the same time as there were strikes and a rise in class struggle. But it was also inspired by the civil rights movement, by the struggle against the war in Vietnam. So these things play off against each other and the political struggles are often what give confidence to workers to struggle inside the trade unions in the economic fight. I mean, if you think about Egypt today, I think is a brilliant example. You've got millions and millions of people taken to the streets. And in the first wave of the Egyptian revolution, millions on the streets. But it took those millions marching and occupying for days and weeks before the trade unions called a general strike, which finally toppled Mubarak. And I think we need to think a lot more about what is the period that we're in today. Where are those struggles likely to come through? Because it's not enough to simply say, we have to fight inside the trade unions, and class struggle is ultimately what we need in order to overthrow capitalism. But in the here and now, where are those struggles actually likely to break out that will give people confidence to be able to then take on the union bureaucracy, to be able to then rebuild the rank and file networks, and all of those kinds of forms of organisation that we need if we're actually going to see class struggle really take off in a meaningful way that we need.
I was on the Pride March in London the other week and ended up marching near a group of people waving Ernst & Young flags because they were accountants, and that's the company that they work for. And I think that reflects a real tendency in LGBT politics, that there's an increasing class polarisation. You have someone like Tim Cook, who's the highest paid chief executive in the world, on $237 million a year, from Apple, who is an out gay man. And you compare that with how things were in the past. Of course, there have always been middle class LGBT people, but you think that, before 67 we were all illegal. You think in the early 80s, AIDS was something which, didn't respect what class you were, whereas now you're getting out gay executives. It's something which affects, it's something which affects gay men and lesbians and trans people differently, but you are starting to get this quite privileged layer, and I think that makes a real difference, and it makes it easier for us to argue class politics as long as we do it right. That's the good news. The bad news is that the fall of the Berlin Wall has meant that many people think that Marxism is irrelevant, so we have to argue for that, or people look to different kinds of politics. People look to queer theory so as to theorise their class anger, and they think of that in terms of respectability. They look to bohemian ideas, or they think about class, but they think of it in a purely sociological sense. I think that we have to get in there. I think we have to be involved in these movements and fight alongside people. I think that when people's ideas are wrong, I think that Jan's absolutely right, we have to polemicise against them. But I think that when they are saying good things, that for example, when there are ideas around intersectionality which bring them towards class politics, then I think that we have to welcome that, but we then have to take them one step further and say that the actual conclusion that they need to come to is Marxist politics. And I think that we need to deal, if we're to reach out to people in this way and take these opportunities, We need to reach out to people. We need to deal with these issues when they come up within the party and make sure that they're dealt with properly. But we also need to be able to relate to people and avoid a kind of orthodoxy, which does sometimes come up. I mean, I wrote an article in the ISJ debating with Sheila McGregor. Someone stands up in a meeting, I think it was yesterday, and says that I'm polemicising against Engels. You know, I think we really need to avoid, any kind of orthodoxy. I would just come back by talking about the experience of Pride, which was where I was wearing a Unison t-shirt with the slogan, "No Pride in Israeli Apartheid." I was handing out postcards against gay travel to Israel because Tel Aviv tries to present itself as a big gay destination. We gave out over 2,000 postcards. What I think that shows is the real opportunities that are out there for work in the trade unions, the real opportunities for building class politics, for building anti-imperialist LGBT politics. As long as we get the approach that we have right to that, then actually there are real opportunities for us to go out and build.
First of all, John, Murray would be proud that you mentioned her, and we'll let them know later on. My name's John Collier, down from Glasgow for Marxism. I can remember as a child, seeing things like race rights in America on TV, growing up, and it's winning things like fair pay for women, Race Relations Act coming in, sex Equality Act coming in, things like that. But these things were only bones that had been thrown to us by government, successive government, and they continue to throw these bones. They forget to tell you. Remember, Thatcher introduced Section 20 to the Education Act, so homosexuality couldn't be taught in schools. Now, that man over there, I'm ashamed to say, I was probably one of these people who picked me for being gay. Because back then, you were allowed to pick on people for being gay. It was wrong. Now, these people are still oppressing us. Now, nowadays, they're oppressing us by making us unemployed. They're keeping our wages down. And the only way that we can fight back at this is to actually walk out the factories, walk out the call centres, don't go back in until they give us back our rights that they have stolen from us. I think that's all I've got to say, really.
Hello, comrades. My name's Jazz. I'm from Brixton Branch, the same branch as Jam, actually. I think it's worth coming back to the issue of why revolutionaries fight oppression and why we put it at the heart of our politics, and that is obviously because unity of the working class is central to the project that we're trying to build, and these divisions of racism, of sexism, of homophobia only weaken that project and weaken the party and the work we're trying to do. And I want to come back to something that Ruth mentioned in her contribution, which is about how political struggles against oppression can actually give workers a confidence in other spheres. And I want to use an example from my workplace, because I started a new job 4 months ago in a very small, ununionised workplace with only 25 workers, all of whom are young, recent graduates. And it was very hard for me as my first job on graduating to go into that and know what to do as a revolutionary. It's very hard to identify who is political, who can you start to talk to about these issues, and where can you start to actually build something. And what happened was, after a few months of not really knowing who to talk to, not knowing how to kind of come out as is, as a lefty in your workplace, what actually happened was that a colleague of mine made a kind of flippant sexist comment on an email list, and about 5 women in my office, which I said only has 25 workers, reacted, absolutely strongly against it, sent him links to the Everyday Sexism Project website and basically told him to fuck off. And it was incredibly useful for me, because suddenly I'm like, oh, they're great, there's 5 women in my office who actually are politically engaged, and it opens up a conversation where I ended up talking to one of them, and it turns out she's Brazilian, and she's following the protests, and she's writing articles about what's happening in Brazil. And it opens up a whole wealth of possibilities for me at work in terms of what I can do and how I can organise. And so I think it's really crucial that even though you know, we know that the working class is central to overthrowing capitalism and oppression with it, that we look for every opportunity we can to build that confidence and to break that down those divisions in order to give women the confidence to be part of our movement. And I thought it was really good as well that, you know, Jan talked about how kind of state provisions for women are under attack, because when we talk about social reproduction, of course it doesn't just happen in the family, it happens in 3 different areas. There's the family, there's also the market that provides privatised childcare and whatnot for women who can afford it, and there's the state that provides subsidised or free education and childcare, etc. And the fact that neoliberalism and austerity is having such a deep impact and is fighting so hard to roll back those gains that we've made presents actually a real crisis for our class. There is a reason why 60% of single mothers do not work full-time, and it's because they simply don't have the economic means to go into full-time work. And that's why it's really central that we throw ourselves into movements to defend these things that women, working class women, have fought for, and that we've gained. Do I have time to make another one? Okay, well, that's
Yeah, I thought that was quite a good example actually about, you know, the idea that when, you know, people who issues of oppression come up in a workplace or whatever, it can often identify some of the best fighters actually, and you notice that in a lot of workplaces the people who will be the people that will fight back or identify with the ideas of feminism or anti-racist actually turn out to be some of the, you know, the best trade union activists when you get to find them. I wanted to talk about actually, you know, the kind of an example really, I think, of how oppressive, whether it's racism or whether it's sexism or homophobia, how these ideas can be broken down in the process of struggle. And a lot of people in the room will probably have heard of the 6-month-long Sparks dispute that took place across 2011-2012 for people who hadn't. It was a group of electricians really driven by the rank and file, despite the fact that the union wouldn't move, who, you know, led a 6-month dispute against a massive attack on pay. You know, obviously in some sense you could argue these people who were motivated by, you know, what was an economic attack on their pay. Almost entirely male workforce. I didn't, in the course of being involved in this dispute, meet one woman spark at all. And you think, you know, we went down there every single week, 6 o'clock, there's people in the room who would have been part of that as well. 6 o'clock in the morning, you're there, you're waiting, you wanted to go down and show these people solidarity, but you also wanted to have an argument with them about the strategy for their dispute and take up political arguments with them. And I thought what was quite interesting was, you know, this is like an entirely male workforce. There was quite a lot of, you know, when you first went down there, the attitudes were not, I think, hostilely sexist or anything, but there was a lot of sexist kind of, you know, ideas that were there that people had in their minds, the attitudes, you know, they'd see you as, you know, sort of the girl that would come along from here, and the way, you know, that stuff would come out in the way that you were spoken to and not really being taken seriously sometimes. And, you know, we went down there despite that, we stood with them in the road, we were often the people that led them into the road actually sometimes, or were the first people out to stand with them in the road, were socialist worker, or women full-time workers for the SWP, or women trade unionists. And, you know, what was interesting actually was that we didn't just go down there to stand for them in solidarity, we went to raise political arguments, and one of the arguments that came up you know, was actually making them take you seriously as an activist who had something to say about their dispute as a woman. But it was also about the question of immigration. You know, every single week you would get into these arguments. There's one guy particularly that had to have these arguments that would last the whole length of the dispute, actually, you know, walking, sitting in the road, going back, picketing outside, about the question of whether or not, you know, Polish workers who were maybe coming in into a situation where they were forced to accept worse conditions were you know, the problem. And every single time we'd have this long argument, at the end of it, he'd always buy a socialist worker, even though he wouldn't quite admit that, you know, he'd agreed, but it was like a symbol of, you know, a symbol really that he'd run out of arguments. And I think that that's the kind of role that socialists have to play in these struggles, is going in and fighting to win these arguments. And him actually buying that socialist worker every week was a symbol really, I think, both of the shift that he made in terms of the arguments around immigration, but also the shift in terms of recognising, you know, me or any other women activist who went down to argue with him as actually a serious fighter that was there in solidarity. So I think this is something that, you know, is absolutely vital role that socialists play in these struggles.
I wanted to agree with the comrade about there's no solid wall between the fight against oppression and the fight against exploitation, because, you know, there's just no division there, because members of our class are oppressed and the ruling class ruling class women, ruling class men, all benefit from the oppression of people of our class. And what I think some experiences I've had in the Socialist Workers' Party that sort of confirm that for me about how important it is to put class at the centre of the fight against oppression. But also how to sort of how you do relate to people who think otherwise. I think it's tragic that, you know, we were at this fantastic, like it was all your birthdays and Christmas arriving at the same time. We had that fantastic enormous strike not so long ago, and the trade union bureaucrats were able to drop a 10-ton weight on it and stop it. And our class is still not yet, in Britain, confident enough to smash through that wall and carry on independent of the trade union bureaucrats. And that can be very disappointing for us. And we can be a bit sort of irritated that our class doesn't feel that confident yet. It hasn't recovered from the defeats of the last 20, 30 years. Though we are getting our confidence back. There is the FBU ballot coming up, there is the NUT ballot coming up. Confidence, we have had some victories, we have had some campaigns, there is the bedroom tax. So it's I think there's a lot of, you know, we are an organised part of our class, but we're not separate to our class. So there is that frustration within the party as well, and that impatience and some loss of confidence. But I think as we saw at the opening rally, the effect on people taking part in those struggles and the fantastic fight against oppression that is part of that fight. But I wanted to talk about a fight against, to defend abortion rights, where the women we were talking to said it's a women's only issue. You mustn't go and include men. And quite fraternally said, well, we'll come and do collections with you, but we'll go and try and talk to the unions as well. We went to a union meeting, because what you do as an SWP union, you do stuff, okay. You talk about it, then you go and do it. And the room was mostly men, and I was quite nervous about talking, because I wasn't able to do that in those days. And they agreed to absolutely support the campaign to defend women's abortion rights, gave us 100 quid, and agreed to come down on the demo and bring the union banner. It was a T&G branch. There were some women in there, but it was mostly men, working class men. I mean, ruling class women benefit from women's oppression. You know, the 30% wages that we get paid less doesn't go to working class men, it goes to ruling class women. That's where it goes. They benefit from it. Anyway, and after the meeting, some of the men came to me and said, I don't want the same thing to happen to my daughter as what happened to my mother. I don't want the same thing to happen in backstreet abortions we're talking about that happened to my sister. But, you know, there isn't this idea that the reality that working class men think, "Ippu puree, women are oppressed."
This is going to be the last speaker from the floor, because I don't want to get bothered by the building steward again for running over. Okay, so thanks for everyone who put their hand up. There were a couple of people I couldn't call in, I'm sorry, who hadn't spoken before, but I did try and call people who hadn't already spoken. Okay, so hello, speak now, and we'll get Jan into someone.
Somebody said earlier on about the link between fighting women's oppression and the class struggle. Someone sort of mentioned we can't really be waiting forever for the class struggle to break out. But I just want to mention 3 sort of concrete examples, that highlight how the class struggle actually is breaking out all the time, and the opportunities are there for us, presently in many ways. The first example actually goes back to the earlier period that Jan mentioned, when in the mid-1970s, I do remember actually being asked to do a meeting on women's oppression for the Chrysler branch of the SWP. We had industrial branches at that time, and I remember reading up Engels and really sort of anxious about it and going out to deliver this meeting, which was absolutely, off the wall to these guys. We spent most of the meeting actually discussing why it was very important that we did not support sort of beauty competitions for women. I mean, that was the level. I had no idea that that's what I was going to be confronted by. And eventually we did get to Engels. It took quite a long time, but the point was that was the sort of blatant sexism. What I do remember in that period, in the mid-70s, going down on a bus to Grunwick's, where women were out on strike and seeking solidarity, which is what happens to every worker, women and men, when they go out on strike, they seek solidarity. And I remember actually marching with the same Chrysler branch
down in support. There was a predominantly male trade union support that went to Grumwicks to support these women, and it became obvious to all concerned, the women and the men, that that was actually the way to win the dispute through that kind of solidarity. The second example is also an older one, and it's to do with the original national abortion campaign, which many of us were involved as like founder members. And we argued, it's the point about how it really makes a difference if socialists are there. We actually argued in the National Abortion Campaign Conference over several years, 75 to 79, we actually argued for turning the campaign out to the working class to seek that kind of solidarity on an issue of oppression. And actually, we won, and we ended up with, what, 80,000 workers coming out of a trade union demonstration, one of the largest demonstrations that have been actually in London, and it was specifically on the issue of abortion, and it was specifically on, you know, how the trade unions could actually raise that issue and support women on that issue of oppression, and it was actually very successful. So, you know, it's also making the point that it makes a difference having socialists there. And the final example, a very recent one, and it was a unison strike. I've also been a teacher for a whole number of years. A unison strike which involved the office women, of whom there were 5, who were on a picket line in the school gate, and it's about the dilemmas that you get, but what having a class position actually means, because the women on the picket line were the lowest paid, among the lowest paid public sector workers in Glasgow City Council, but the woman who was in answering the phone and doing their job, the job of 5 women, was the head teacher, who was one of the highest paid women in Glasgow City Council. And on the picket line, you had, myself included, a number of people, including male teachers who would not cross the picket line, lost a day's pay in solidarity. Now, you think of that scenario there, how can you possibly approach that in any meaningful way without actually having class politics? And it really shows to me that day and daily, even in small scale, socialists, very important as socialists, they're arguing, but also workers can actually learn all sorts of lessons. 100 years of class struggle history, you know, in a few minutes in such situations, and they happen every day.
Thanks for having contributed, Jan Sullivan.
Right, okay. Well, I think firstly, people are absolutely right when they say that we must be involved in any movement against oppression that manifests itself. Of course we do, and I can't actually, I'm trying to think of one which we haven't been involved in. I just can't think of one that we haven't been involved in. I do have to admit, I personally didn't go down into the riots when they took place in Clapham Junction, but I was very keen that my sons did. And certainly at school, the next day, I raised, because there were kids from our school who were arrested during that, as a trade union branch, I immediately called a branch meeting, and we put pressure on the head and the deputy head to make sure that those children who were being caught picking Mars Basel trainers, whatever it was, actually had, had representation. I whooped with joy. It was fantastic to see young people tearing up the bastions of, trainer or, child labour in the Philippines. Absolutely right. So I don't think there's any argument about this. I think we are involved, we should be involved, and we always are. The point is, I think though, that we have to understand is that because the nature of movements mean that they attract people with very, very diverse politics. I mean, I was struck when I went to the relaunch of Beyond the Fragments conference, that a young woman that I recognised called Rosie spoke from the UK Uncut. And I think in a way she personified it. Because what she actually said from the platform is that some mornings I wake up and I'm a socialist. The next morning I wake up and I'm a Lib Dem member. And the next morning I wake up and I think I'm a Tory. Now, actually, you wonder where the logic of that is going. But, what she said is really political ideas don't matter as long as you're involved in activity. And I think that, of course, we have to work in these movements, and that's really the only point, which I don't think there seems to be much disagreement on, we do have to argue, a socialist political argument, because the very diverse nature of the ideas inside most of the movements mean it's exactly what the basis of when we say they tend to rise like rockets but drop like stones. The student movement, the Millbank, was the high point, but they weren't able to sustain that into anything meaningful, really, since then. We did have an occupation of Sussex University, which of course our comrades had to be involved in, but it didn't actually spread. That's the nature of often movements, and we have to recognise that. That is why we argue for a revolutionary party, and we argue for revolutionary arguments. And also, I think, just the thing, at point, and Ruth has gone, but so I'm agreeing, she is right, that we can gain enormous confidence from struggles that take place that are not inside the organised working class, but come from different groups. But I certainly would say that if you look, for instance, at the difference between the American women's movement in the 1960s and 70s and the British movement, the fact that in America the left had been smashed because of the Taft-Hartley legislation and because of the witch hunt, McCarthyism against the left, it really meant that the American movement wasn't able. It didn't relate to working class people. It resulted in really the national organisation of women, which really just focused on getting key women into positions. It was all about equality with men in the ruling class. It was essentially a bourgeois feminist movement, which shows the difference in Britain was that socialists were involved, that the socialists helped to shape the demands of that movement. So, of course, the answer today, let's work with those people, exactly as Colin says. We work with the oppressed groups, we fight with the oppressed groups, but we also have to retain an autonomy of a political argument, which is an argument about the importance of changing the world in total, not winning reforms, but keeping the pressure on the ruling class to build a different sort of world.